This video will present some of the innovations highlighted at the Paris 1889 World Fair. Once again, I am grateful for the scholarship of Annegret Fauser in her book Musical Encounters at the 1889 Paris World's Fair. Although the use of electricity was not widespread in 1889, the use of electric batteries was commercially available at that time. Let's look at this brief video.
Alessandro Volta was born into an aristocratic family in the Italian town of Como on the 18th of February 1745. Even as a schoolboy, he showed a great interest in science, in particular electricity. At this time, while the phenomenon of electricity as such was familiar, not much was known about its origins. Volta showed that as long as you have a conductive liquid such as brine, all you needed was two different metals in order to demonstrate an electric effect. This is known as the voltaic effect. He started experimenting with various metals and looking into their properties. His measuring instrument was his own tongue. If you touch it with two different metals at the same time, an electric current will flow. It makes itself felt as a tingly, sour taste. Painstakingly, Volta tested every possible combination of metals. He entered them in a table. The order corresponded to the strength of the electric reaction. However, he didn't only investigate metals like zinc, tin, lead, iron, copper, platinum, gold, silver, and mercury, which he called conductors of the first class. He also discovered that liquids and bodily fluids were conductors too. These he called conductors of the second class. His results meant that his long-lasting dispute with Galvani was finally settled in his favor, and the upshot was an invention that made him world famous. For in his experiments, he had realized that the electrical effect could be substantially increased by introducing an acid between the different metals. He constructed a device which made him famous, the voltaic pile. Volta constructed a column consisting of copper coins alternating with plates of zinc. The metals were separated by leather discs soaked in brine. When he connected the two ends of the voltaic pile with a wire and his hand, electric current flowed. Volta had invented the first battery.
Electricity by the means of direct current batteries was the innovation that powered many important 19th century innovations. The most important of these was the electric telegraph. Let's watch this video on the telegraph.
The electronic telegraph began its life in different parts of Europe and North America. Its ascent to media dominance during the 1800s was due in part to the growing railroad networks. The need to communicate faster than the transportation of messages via railroad or boats was finally resolved in 1837. Samuel Morse effectively patented the first electronic telegraph for instantaneous communication. It finally separated transportation from communication, breaking down all barriers of time and space by reducing the time between information being produced to its reception. The sender inputs their message using Morse code on one end, transporting it across transcontinental wires, while the receiver automatically records the transmission on the other end. In 1843, the U.S. government paid to string wires 35 miles from Washington to Baltimore. And within a few years, the first telegraph line had sprouted a system stretching across the United States. This telegraph network unified the United States across all major cities. However, the next step was aimed at breaking the continental isolation between Europe and North America. On August 5, 1858, a successful wire connection was laid across the Atlantic Ocean, using undersea cables to connect Newfoundland to Ireland. It was during this time that Samuel Morse sent the first transatlantic message, "What hath God wrought?" This message marked the beginning of a long and arduous journey to establish a stable means for long-distance communication.
An entire pavilion was dedicated to the telephone. Let me point out a few important features of the building. In the center is an array of trumpet-like bells that are broadcast speakers. These were for amplifying a composition called Fanfare Aider. Performers in one location would sing into microphones that were then broadcast through the trumpet-like bells. The electric energy was carried by wires from the microphones to those speakers. I mentioned in the last video about the importance of opera. And here is one of the stunning announcements. They said one of the biggest successes of the exposition every evening from 8:30 to 11 p.m. was at the Pavilion of the Telephones. And they called these telephonic auditions. They set up some microphones in the Opera Comique, which was two different theaters. And in the afternoon, they also had, I guess there was a place for that. So for one franc, you could go in and then listen for 10 minutes to these telephones and hear what was happening in another theater, in another location. And you can see here there's some people listening to the opera. It's a stethoscope type contraption that goes to the ear, and then there is some sort of speaker that is connected to those stethoscopes. Now, the public was just amazed that this could happen. And here's an artistic rendition of how this works. So you've got the opera house over here, someone on stage singing. They had two microphones, one for the left ear, one for the right. And that's probably why the music is in two streams. You see this music is streaming across the air. Actually, it wasn't the air, it was a telephone line. And then in this part, you've got it being received by these people who, well, in this case, it looks like they're even dancing. But we know in the picture that they were actually listening through some sort of headset of some sort, those stethoscope listening devices. So this is fascinating that you have here the broadcast, the opera over the wires here. The broadcast of music by wire was one innovation, but another innovation demonstrated was the use of recorded music. So they would record music and then play it at a later time. Here's a listing of music that was probably available for listeners at that time. Notice all these recordings are of smaller groups. So here's solo violin, here's a solo cornet, here's a duet, two instruments, here's voice and piano, here's a flute trio. The reason for that is that these smaller groups were easier to record than the larger group. They only had a few microphones that they could set up, and it was hard to get balance. Now, Here's an example of the phonograph listening. Once again, they have these stethoscope-like devices. Now let's listen to a video that demonstrates Edison's 1880s phonograph. Well, this concludes our lectures on the 19th century. I hope that you have now understood and can summarize the context and structures of cultural traditions of music in the 19th century. Furthermore, I hope you have grasped the many innovations that were necessary for the production of 19th century music. Thank you.